In the spring of 1948, a country that did not yet officially exist was already fighting for its life. Its soldiers had no tanks, no armored personnel carriers, no factories. What they had were truck chassis, boilerplate steel, and engineers willing to weld the two together at night while the British were not watching. The vehicles that rolled out of those makeshift workshops could barely stop a rifle bullet. But they carried supplies into besieged cities, evacuated children from settlements under attack, and kept a fragile new state alive long enough to survive its first week. What happened over the following 7 decades is one of the most remarkable stories in the history of armored warfare. A nation that started with improvised trucks ended up building the most survivable tank on Earth, the most protected infantry carrier ever conceived, and the first army in history to replace soldiers with autonomous robots on a live combat perimeter. 36 vehicles, 76 years, every single one of them shaped by a lesson written in blood. Chapter 1. Steel from Nothing, The Improvised Years, and the First Conventional Fleet, 1947 to 1956. The first armored vehicles of the Haganah, the Jewish underground army in British-controlled Palestine, were not designed by engineers. They were improvised by metal workers in workshops across Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Jerusalem, beginning in November 1947. The British authorities permitted some armored construction but absolutely forbade the installation of turrets or weapons. So, the Haganah engineers hid Sten guns inside false compartments, welded firing slits into body panels that looked like ventilation gaps from the outside, and built an entire secret arsenal hidden in plain sight. Between the 28th of December 1947 and the 15th of April 1948, 6 companies produced 127 of these improvised armored trucks. The armor itself was a sandwich of boilerplate, rubber, wood, and thin sheet metal pressed together, layered to defeat rifle fire. Soldiers called them sandwiches. They were overweight, their engines were overtaxed, and they offered almost no protection against anything heavier than a pistol round. But they worked. They ran convoys into the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem when every road was contested. They evacuated civilian settlements when Egyptian forces were advancing. The buses came next, built on the same principle, with steel plating hidden inside the passenger cabin. One convoy of these armored buses was headed for Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem on the 13th of April 1948, when Arab forces ambushed it and destroyed it, killing 79 people. That day made clear that improvised civilian vehicles had a hard ceiling. The Haganah needed something real. What arrived first was equally improvised but more honest about it. Israel acquired surplus American M3 and M5 half-tracks, approximately 3,500 of them. The same open-topped vehicles American GIs in World War II had nicknamed Purple Heart boxes for their thin armor and zero overhead protection. The IDF called them Zaklam. They were the backbone of Israeli infantry transport for the first 2 decades of the state's existence. Most armies had moved past them years earlier. Israel had no choice. The first true tanks were M4 Shermans, acquired before and after independence through arms dealers and smuggling networks. Several were among vehicles agents purchased in the United States and repainted as agricultural equipment to get them past export controls. They fought in the 1948 War of Independence alongside a handful of Cromwell tanks obtained through British deserters. They were the only armor Israel had, and the men who crewed them had often never been inside a tank before. Then France entered the picture. Beginning in 1956, Israel acquired approximately 400 AMX, 1-3 light tanks, organized into 3 full battalions. The AMX 1-3 was a 1-3-ton vehicle with an oscillating turret, meaning the gun and the upper turret elevation moved as a single unit. A design that allowed an autoloader to function but limited depression angles and made the turret harder to protect. The gun was a 75mm cannon derived from the German Panther's armament. France produced these from 1953 onward, and Israel received them just in time for the 1956 Suez Campaign. The IDF used the AMX 13 inches, ways its designers never anticipated. Lacking heavier tanks in sufficient numbers, Israeli commanders committed AMX-13 battalions to frontline combat against Egyptian armor in 1967, where their light protection cost them heavily. 3 battalions fought. Losses were significant. When the dust settled, surviving hulls were progressively modernized by NIMDA with improved fire control and eventually sold to Singapore, their career as frontline Israeli tanks effectively over. That same French connection produced something more durable. After examining the AMX-13's 75mm gun in detail, Israeli engineers selected it for installation on existing Sherman hulls. A pilot vehicle was ready in 1956. After trials, serial production began, and the M50 Super Sherman was born. The first 25 vehicles deployed in the Sinai campaign that same year. By 1964, Israel had converted 300 Shermans to M50 standard across 2 production variants, the Continental, using the original gasoline engine, and the Cummins, running a 460 horsepower diesel that was less flammable and more reliable in desert conditions. But even the M50 was running out of time. By 1961, Israel had ordered a French 105mm gun, the Model F1, originally designed for the AMX-30. The barrel was shortened from 56 calibers to 44, fitted with a muzzle brake and married to a modified turret on a Cummins-powered Sherman hull. The result was the M51, publicly unveiled during an Independence Day ceremony in 1965, and known informally, though never officially, as the Isherman. Approximately 180 were converted. They were still in reserve service in 1973, when 374 M50S and M51S remained in an IDF tank fleet that totaled 2,209 vehicles. A World War II tank design, updated twice, fighting in a Cold War conflict, not because anyone planned it that way, but because Israel had learned to make the most of what it had. Chapter 2: Foreign Iron, Israeli Hands, the Centurions, Pattons, and captured Soviet steel. In 1958, Israel purchased surplus British Centurion tanks, Mark III and Mark V variants, redesignating them Shote, which means whip. They arrived with the original 20-pounder gun. The IDF immediately began upgrading them. First, the gun, replaced with a licensed 105mm L7. Then, the engine, replaced with the American Continental AVDS diesel. Then, the fire control. Then, the suspension. By the time Israeli engineers were finished, the Shote Kal, the final production variant, was a fundamentally different machine wearing a British body. It fought in 1967, 1973, and 1982. After 1973, surviving hulls were fitted with blazer-reactive armor, small bolt-on panels of explosive material that detonated against incoming shaped-charge warheads, reducing their penetration before they reached the steel beneath. At approximately the same time, Israel was acquiring American M48 Patton tanks, roughly 200 of them, designated Magach, a name covering a whole family of progressively upgraded variants from Magach 1 through Magach 5. The basic pattern was consistent: strip out what was American and replace it with what worked better. The original gasoline engine went, a Continental diesel went in. The 90mm gun was replaced with a 105mm. Fire control was upgraded. Israeli communication equipment replaced the American radios. The Magach 5 bore almost no resemblance internally to the M48 it started as. When the M60 Patton arrived, Israel bought approximately 560 of them and ran the same process, producing the Magach 6 and Magach 7 series. The Magach 6 Bigal Batosh was the terminal evolution of that line, an M60A3 rebuilt to Israeli specifications with advanced fire control, a thermal sleeve on the main gun, and the full blazer reactive armor suite. These tanks fought in 1,982 inches Lebanon. They would eventually be replaced by the Merkava. But in the interim, the IDF had developed something unusual: the ability to take any tank from any country and make it significantly better than it started. That talent reached its strangest expression after 1967. When Israeli forces swept across the Sinai and the Golan, they found hundreds of abandoned Soviet T-54 and T-55 tanks, many left intact by their crews. Most armies would have assessed, photographed, and scrapped them. The IDF saw a ready-made armored fleet. The T-54S became Tyran 4, the T-55S became Tyran 5. The first conversions were minimal: extra stowage, modified hatches, Israeli radios. Later versions went much further. The Russian 100mm gun in the Tyran 4 was replaced with a license-built American 105mm M68, the same gun used on the Centurion and the Magach. New engines were fitted. Israeli fire control replaced Soviet optics, which had been calibrated for crews selected from the shortest 5% of Soviet draftees. The Tyran series ended up equipped like Israeli tanks because they had effectively become Israeli tanks. The 1973 war added another Soviet vehicle to the fleet. Captured T-62 tanks became the Tyran 6. Unlike the T-54 and T-55, these were not significantly rearmed. The T-62's 115mm smoothbore gun had proven devastatingly effective against Israeli armor during the October fighting, and the IDF kept it, using the captured Tyran 6S in reserve units until the Merkava production made them redundant. For a period in the mid-1970s, Israel's tank force included M48S, M60S, Centurions, Shermans, T-54S, T-55S, and T-62S, all wearing IDF markings, all maintained by the same Ordnance Corps, sharing ammunition with each other wherever the gun calibers overlapped. It was a logistical achievement, as impressive as any battle. Chapter 3: Carrying the Infantry. From half-tracks to the APC that changed everything. For the first 2 decades of Israeli military history, the half-track was the infantry's ride. The M3 and M5 half-tracks, those 3,500 surplus American vehicles, carried Israeli soldiers through 1,948, 1,956, and 1,967. They were slow, unprotected from above, and vulnerable to almost every weapon the enemy carried. But they were available, and availability is the first requirement of any military vehicle. By 1973, most half-tracks had been replaced in frontline service by the M113, the American aluminum armored personnel carrier that the United States supplied in quantities exceeding 6,000 vehicles. The IDF called it Bardalis, Cheetah, and informally called it Zelda, slang borrowed from American Jewish culture. The M113 was a vast improvement over the half-track. It was fully enclosed, amphibious, and mechanically simple. Its aluminum armor stopped small arms and shell fragments. It did not stop rocket-propelled grenades. And in 1973, Arab armies had RPGs everywhere. The IDF lost M113S in painful numbers in that war. Israeli engineers responded with layered add-on armor packages. The Toga scheme, later refined as the Vizada upgrade, mounted perforated steel plates on an external frame around the hull. The theory was that the perforation would cause an RPG's shape-charged warhead to detonate before reaching the base hull, disrupting the jet of superheated copper that did the actual penetrating. It worked, partially. A partial solution to an RPG is still better than no solution. The M113 chassis also became the platform for the Machbet, an Israeli-specific air defense vehicle that took the American M163 Vulcan air defense system, a 20mm rotary cannon on an M113, and added 4 FIM-92 Stinger surface-to-air missile tubes alongside it, giving a single vehicle both gun and missile intercept capability. The half-track era and the M113 era produced the same hard conclusion. Neither vehicle was survivable enough for the combat Israel was actually fighting. That conclusion had a direct consequence. It produced an entirely different philosophy of infantry transport, one that would eventually make Israel the global pioneer of the heavy armored personnel carrier. A concept so radical that most armies still struggle to afford it. Chapter 4: The Heavy Iron Revolution, Centurions Reborn, Soviet Hulls Repurposed, and the Merkava that defined an era. The Israeli Ordnance Corps does not like waste. When the Merkava entered service in 1979 and began replacing the Centurion Shote tanks in frontline brigades, hundreds of retired hulls became available. Most armies would have scrapped them. Israel stripped their turrets, rebuilt their interiors, and produced something that had barely existed before: a dedicated, heavy armored personnel carrier built on a main battle tank chassis. The Nagmashot was the first, produced through the late 1970s and 1980s. The turret came off. The weight saved went into belly armor against mines. A troop compartment replaced the fighting space. It was basic, but it was on a Centurion hull, which meant its armor protection was genuinely comparable to the tanks it was operating alongside. The infantry riding inside was no longer the most vulnerable thing on the battlefield. The Nagmashon refined the concept further, entering service around 1991, with a distinctive tall superstructure and multiple vision blocks, including a non-rotating doghouse cupola that let crew observe and fire without exposing themselves above the hull. Some variants added a fully enclosed machine gun nest on top of the superstructure, which crews called the Mifflet set, the monster, after its ungainly appearance. It allowed soldiers to fire while protected from snipers during the grinding urban operations of Lebanon. The Puma appeared in the same period, also built on the Centurion Shote hull. It was technically a combat engineering vehicle, but at 50 tons, with a crew of 10, it functioned as a heavy APC as much as anything else. It carried dozer blades, mine rollers, line charges, and an electronic warfare suite that could jam or remotely detonate nearby explosive devices. A Puma could clear a path through a minefield while protecting its crew inside armor that would have been considered excellent for a main battle tank a generation earlier. The Nakpadon came last in the Centurion family, accepted into service in 1993. Third-generation reactive armor covered virtually its entire surface. The belly was heavily reinforced. At approximately 50 tons, with no main gun at all, it was an armored bus, the most protected armored bus in any army's inventory. A variant, called the Nagmapop, mounted a telescoping observation mast on its back, 6 articulated sections that extended 30 meters above the vehicle, carrying thermal optics. A 50-ton mobile watchtower used by combat intelligence units in some of the most contested terrain in the Middle East. The 2006 Lebanon War put all of these vehicles to the test. 14 Axorets and Pumas were struck by advanced Russian-made anti-tank guided missiles, the kind of weapons that had been destroying tanks throughout the conflict. 7 soldiers were killed, 14 vehicles hit, 7 dead. In a lighter vehicle, that same number of hits would have killed dozens. The heavy APC philosophy was validated in the most brutal way possible. While the Centurion family was being developed, the concept had also been applied to captured Soviet steel. The Aksarit, whose name means Cruel One in Hebrew, began with a stockpile of captured T-55 tanks that the IDF had accumulated after 1967 and 1973. By 1987, the Nimda company was rebuilding them into something their Soviet designers would not have recognized. The turret came off entirely. The engine was relocated from the rear of the hull to the front left position, freeing the rear for a troop compartment accessed by a ramp. A new American Detroit diesel replaced the original Soviet engine, producing 650 horsepower in the early Aksarit 1 variant and 850 horsepower in the later Aksarit 2, giving the 44-ton vehicle a top speed of 65 kilometers per hour. Composite armor panels and explosive reactive armor covered the exterior. 4 roof-mounted 7.62 mm machine guns provided suppressive fire. Formal IDF adoption came in 1988, and production reached approximately 276 vehicles. The IDF had considered buying the American M2 Bradley instead. They rejected it. No foreign vehicle was considered survivable enough. That judgment was not arrogance. It was based on operational analysis of what Israeli infantry was actually being asked to survive. That same year the Akjarat was adopted, Israel was also quietly building something else, something that would remain classified for 30 years. The Pere, which means wild one in Hebrew, looked exactly like a Magach tank. It had a hull, a turret, a gun barrel. From the outside, it was indistinguishable from the M60, based patent variants in widespread IDF service. Except the turret was a dummy. The gun barrel was a prop. Beneath a hinged roof panel sat a retractable launcher housing 12 Spike NLAWS precision anti-tank guided missiles, each with a range of up to 25 kilometers, guided by electro-optical systems after launch. A single Pere could engage and destroy armor far beyond the visual horizon of any conventional tank in any army. It was operational from the mid-1980s. Its existence was not officially confirmed until June 2015, when images that had leaked during the 2006 Lebanon War finally prompted the IDF to acknowledge what they showed. The Pere was retired in 2017. While Israel was converting Centurions and rebuilding T-55s, it was also building something from scratch, something that would define Israeli armored philosophy for the next 50 years. Chapter 5: Iron Chariot, the Merkava and its Children. The Merkava program began in 1970, driven by a single, inescapable conclusion. Israel could not rely on foreign tank suppliers. France had embargoed weapons. Britain had restrictions. The United States had conditions. In 3 wars, Israeli soldiers had been sent into battle in other nations' surplus equipment. After 1973, after 1,500 tankers dead in a single conflict, that was no longer acceptable. Major General Israel Tal led the design team. Tal had commanded armored units in 1956, 1967, and 1973. He had watched tank crews burn. The Merkava, which means chariot in Hebrew, would be built around one principle above everything else: the crew comes home alive. Every design decision followed from that principle. The engine went to the front of the hull, a radical departure from conventional tank architecture. In most tanks, the engine sits at the rear. In the Merkava, it sits ahead of the crew, adding its mass as another barrier against frontal hits. The rear of the hull was freed for a large troop door and an internal compartment that could carry several infantry soldiers or, in a medical emergency, up to 4 stretchers. No other main battle tank in the world was designed from the beginning to function as an armored ambulance. The prototype was complete in 1974. Full production began in 1977. The Merkava Mark. I entered IDF service in 1979. 250 vehicles built. The first main battle tank ever designed and manufactured entirely within Israel. It fired its first shots in combat in June 1982 inches Lebanon, where it engaged Syrian T-72 tanks. The crew protection philosophy held. Losses occurred, but crews survived hits that would have killed them in any contemporary Western vehicle. The Merkava Mk2 entered service in 1983. Upgraded spaced armor on the turret and hull sides. Ball-chain anti-RPG screens hanging from the turret bustle, which would pre-detonate rocket warheads before they reached the base armor. Improved fire control. Every modification traced to a specific engagement, a specific loss, in Lebanon. The Mark III arrived in 1990 with the most significant firepower upgrade to date. A domestically produced 120mm smoothbore gun, replacing the 105mm. The new gun fired NATO standard ammunition and achieved penetration performance competitive with the best tanks in the world. The Mark III also carried more internal ammunition than any previous Merkava and featured improved night fighting systems developed by Israeli domestic industry. The Merkava Mark IV, entering service in 2004, brought 2 revolutionary capabilities. A new 1,500 horsepower turbocharged diesel gave it dramatically improved mobility, and it was the first production tank in the world to be operationally fitted with the Trophy Active Protection System, a Rafael-developed radar-guided hard-kill interceptor that could detect, classify, track, and destroy incoming anti-tank missiles and rocket-propelled grenades before they reached the hull. Trophy worked. Its operational record of successful intercepts eventually convinced the United States Army to fit it to M1A2 Abrams tanks, a reversal of the usual direction in which American-Israeli military technology moved. The Merkava Mark V, designated Barak, was revealed in 2023. It incorporates artificial intelligence-based threat processing, an augmented reality helmet display giving the commander a synthesized picture of the battlefield drawn from multiple sensor sources, and the Wind Guard active protection system. The Barak was the first Israeli tank designed with AI-integrated sensor fusion as a core architecture rather than an added system. Over 2,000 Merkavas of all marks were produced at the Tel HaShomer facility. The Merkava had another child, one that the IDF had actually been thinking about since the mid-1980s. The concept was simple. Take a Merkava hull, remove the gun, extend the rear compartment, add a door. What you get is the most heavily armored personnel carrier ever built by any nation. The IDF tested 4 prototype vehicles based on Merkava Mark I chassis as early as the 1980s, calling the project Namara, which means leopardess. Then, funding dried up. The Axarit was cheaper, and the converted T-55 hulls were already available. The concept went dormant. What brought it back was a single operation in Gaza in 2004. Israeli infantry were moving in M113. They encountered improvised explosive devices and RPGs. The M113 offered no meaningful protection. The losses forced the question, why were Israeli soldiers still riding to battle in a 1950s aluminum box when they had the most survivable tank in the world parked outside? Development restarted immediately. The Namer, renamed from the earlier Namera designation, was the first IDF vehicle designed entirely by computer-aided design, which allowed engineers to model armor configurations, internal volume, and crew ergonomics simultaneously rather than through physical prototypes. On the 1st of March 2008, the IDF presented the first fully operational Namer, built from scratch, on a Merkava Mk.4 chassis. By September 2008, it was publicly unveiled. The Namer weighs 66 tons. That is heavier than any other armored personnel carrier ever produced by any nation in history. It carries a crew of 3 and 8 infantry soldiers behind the same classified composite and reactive armor package fitted to the Merkava Mk4. 4 external cameras provide 360-degree visibility without anyone exposing themselves above the hull. The remote weapon station can mount a 12.7 mm heavy machine gun or a 40 mm automatic grenade launcher. In February 2023, Israel signed an agreement with Oshkosh Defense to produce hundreds of the upgraded Namer 1500 variant in the United States before shipping the hulls to Israel for weapons integration. The same production model used to expedite the original Namer's delivery schedule, now scaled to hundreds of vehicles. Israel also needed a Scout, something lighter, something domestically designed. In 1975, IAI's Ramta division produced the RBY Mk1, Israel's first wholly indigenous wheeled light armored reconnaissance vehicle. It weighed 3,600 kilograms, carried 2 crew and up to 6 passengers, and reached 100 kilometers per hour on a 4x4 chassis with 8 to 10 millimeters steel armor. It was not intended to survive a tank round. It was intended to see the enemy before the enemy saw it. The Ram Scout Car family expanded on the concept with multiple specialized variants. The Ram Recce for standard reconnaissance, the Ram AT mounting a 106 mm recoilless rifle for anti-armor work, and the Ram TCM fitted with a twin 20 mm cannon for short-range air defense, a single domestic platform, 3 distinct combat roles. More than 450 Ram Mark III vehicles were eventually delivered to military customers worldwide. Chapter 6: Wheels, Robots, and What Comes Next. By the second decade of the 21st century, the IDF had built the most capable tracked heavy armor force on Earth. It had also recognized that it was carrying infantry to some battles in vehicles that were 60 years old. The Eitan, whose name means steadfast, was the IDF's answer to that problem, and it represented a significant philosophical departure. For decades, the IDF had rejected wheeled armored vehicles as insufficiently protected and poorly suited to Israeli terrain. The Eitan was the first domestically designed wheeled armored fighting vehicle in Israeli history. The decision to build it came directly from a specific engagement in 2014, in which 7 Israeli soldiers were killed when an M113 was struck by an anti-tank missile in the Shujaiya neighborhood of Gaza. 7 soldiers in a single vehicle, destroyed by a weapon that a heavier platform would have survived. The program began immediately. Unveiled by the Israeli Ministry of Defense in August 2016, the Eitan weighs under 35 tons, roughly half the Namer. Its 8x8 drivetrain reaches 90 km per hour on roads. Its hull is V-shaped at the bottom, specifically designed to deflect mine blast energy away from the crew compartment rather than channeling it upward. Active protection comes from Elbit Systems' Iron Fist light decoupled system, chosen over Raphael's trophy after a competitive evaluation in 2019 because the lighter interceptor package fit the Eitan's weight margins better. The armed variant mounts an unmanned turret with a 30mm cannon, a coaxial 7.62mm machine gun, and Spike anti-tank guided missiles. The Nahal Infantry Brigade received the first production vehicles in May 2023. The total Eitan fleet is expected to number in the hundreds across APC, turreted IFV, and command vehicle variants, finally retiring the M113S that have been in IDF service for more than 5 decades. And then Israel went somewhere no army had gone before. The Guardium was developed by GNIUS, a joint venture between Israel Aerospace Industries and Elbit Systems. It was based on a Tomcar off-road buggy chassis, capable of autonomous or remote-controlled operation at speeds up to 80 km per hour, carrying a payload of 300 kilograms, including light armor protection for its critical systems. Following a successful evaluation in 2005, the IDF selected it for border security operations. The first production batch was delivered in May 2008. By 2012, the IDF publicly acknowledged that Guardium vehicles were conducting autonomous patrols along both the Gaza border and the Syrian border. Israel was the first country in the world to replace human soldiers with unmanned robots on a continuous operational military perimeter. The Guardium could operate for 24 hours or longer without human intervention, following pre-programmed patrol routes, detecting intruders, transmitting intelligence to a command center, and engaging threats with lethal or less lethal weapons. The joint development program between IAI and Elbit was formally terminated in 2016, but Guardium vehicles remained in IDF operational service. The IAI Jaguar, a 6-wheeled unmanned ground vehicle developed by Israel Aerospace Industries, entered operational service as a border patrol and escort platform. The IDF's 7th Armored Brigade conducted formal combined arms training alongside Jaguar vehicles, becoming one of the first ground combat formations in military history to integrate advanced ground robotics into standard unit exercises. Israel Aerospace Industries unveiled the Rex Mk2 at the DSEI Defense Exhibition in London in 2021. A 4-wheeled unmanned vehicle capable of carrying a 7.62mm weapon system, operating autonomously or under wireless control by a single operator. The Rex Mk2 was designed for logistics missions to forward troops over IED-threatened routes, resupplying positions that no manned vehicle could safely reach. In June 2022, Elbit Systems unveiled the Medium Robotic Combat Vehicle at the Eurosatory Defense Exposition in Paris. It was based on the BLR-2 unmanned ground platform, mounting an autonomous 30mm turret developed by the IDF Tank and APC Directorate, a turret that could identify, track, and engage targets. On a vehicle with no human crew aboard at all, the IDF announced it would begin testing the system in 2023. Chapter 7: The Distance Traveled. 36 vehicles, 76 years. The distance between them is not measured in time, it is measured in funerals. Every vehicle on this list exists because some version of the vehicle before it failed to protect someone. The sandwiches were replaced by half-tracks because sandwiches got ambushed. The half-tracks were replaced by M113S because the half-tracks were open to the sky. The M113S were supplemented by Centurion APCs and Oxyrits because M113S burned. The Namer exists Because the lessons of 2004 and 2006 made a 66-ton armored carrier the only morally acceptable answer to the question of how you move infantry across a battlefield saturated with anti-tank weapons. The Merkava exists because France embargoed the Mirage 5, and Israel realized it could not build a credible military on platforms it was not allowed to own. The Tyran series exists because Israel captured hundreds of Soviet tanks and refused to let them go to waste. The Para existed for 30 years in plain sight, disguised as a tank that everyone could see, doing a job that no one knew it was doing. The Guardium, the Jaguar, the Rex Mk2, the medium robotic combat vehicle, these are not science fiction. They are operational systems, developed and fielded by a military that reached an unavoidable conclusion. The cheapest way to protect a soldier is to remove the soldier from the most dangerous position on the battlefield. An unmanned system can be lost and replaced. A soldier cannot. The principle that produced the sandwich armored truck in 1947 is the same principle that produced the autonomous combat robot in 2022. You take the best technology available. You improve it beyond what the original designers thought possible. And when no one will sell you what you need, you build it yourself. What is currently operating out of Israeli armored formations, both the ones you can see and the ones you cannot, suggests that principle has not changed. And given what is already in the field, it is not about to.